My guess is that you use social media. If you found this video, that means you're probably currently on social media this very second. But here is a question that you should ask yourself if you haven't asked it already. If you're a Christian, how should you think about social media? Is it good, bad, neutral, maybe some combination of all three? And if you're not a Christian watching, maybe by the end of this video, you'll be more interested in Christianity, or maybe you'll be less. Time will tell. Now, this is the argument that I'm going to make, and I'll be upfront about it. I think social media has incredible benefits for Christians. And I'm not just talking about the benefits you might be thinking of, like how it helps you maybe keep in touch with your old friends, or gives you some relief from boredom, or helps you stay up to date with the news. I'm talking about real, concrete, God-related benefits. And I'm hoping by the end of our time together, you're going to look at social media in a new light. But before I can explain what I mean, we first have to look at a parallel situation that was happening in the Bible. And I think it will show us how we should be thinking about using social media today as Christians. The book of Acts in the Bible is all about how Jesus' followers start to spread Christianity throughout the world. It starts right after Jesus comes back to life. And yes, that's something crazy that we Christians believe, just by the way. And so after Jesus is killed, God brings him back to life. And then he gives his followers this message. And it says this: "So when the apostles were with Jesus, they kept asking him, 'Lord, has the time come for you to free Israel and restore our kingdom?'" Now, because Jesus was Jewish, many of his followers believed that he would come and free the entire nation of Israel from their Roman rulers. But then Jesus replied, "The Father alone has the authority to set those dates and times, and they are not for you to know. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So Jesus, he gives his followers this charge to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And then what do we find in the book of Acts? We find this exact story happening. The apostles, they start in Jerusalem, spread the message of Jesus, and to move outward through Judea, Samaria, and even as far as Rome. And so Acts moves in this structure, this geographical structure, away from Jerusalem out into the world. And about a third of the way through the book, this guy Paul comes onto the scene, and he really kicks things into high gear. I recently finished this big, 450-page biography about the Apostle Paul, and it talks about all his journeys throughout the Roman Empire, spreading the gospel to places further and further away. You could probably make the argument that nobody spread the gospel further and faster than Paul did. And by the end of his life, he basically brought the gospel to the ends of the earth, which is exactly what Jesus had wanted his followers to do. But verse after verse in Acts, we read things like Paul traveled from this place to this place, because he was traveling all over. And if you look at the locations on a map of where he went, you can see that sometimes he had to travel hundreds of miles at a time to spread the gospel. And it's easy to skip past those verses talking about his location because they sort of just seem like they're adding extra random information. But what you find out if you do a little bit of research is that if Paul had tried to make these journeys a few centuries earlier, it literally would not have been possible. Because Paul and other people in his day had access to something that simply did not exist. It was the Roman system of roads. This was this massive technological feat. Rome had developed one of the largest and most comprehensive road systems that had ever existed. It united towns out in the middle of nowhere with all the big cities. And it allowed Paul to be able to spread the news about Jesus, the good news, the gospel, to people who would have had no chance to hear it otherwise. I was recently listening to a podcast with a guy named Tom Rainer, and he said, these Roman roads were radical in that day. They had proper drainage. They had cleared through the forest. They went over borderways. It was a technological marvel of that day. And instead of looking at the Roman roads and saying, the dirty Roman government has messed up our land, the early followers of Christ said, we have this new communication system and this culture that's not friendly to Christianity. Let's see what we can do in God's power. You could probably make a pretty good argument that early Christianity would have simply died out as a small religious group that was loosely related to Judaism if there hadn't been this Roman road system. And maybe that's why God decided that Jesus should be born when he was. Paul talks about Jesus being born in the fullness of time. Maybe that's part of what he's referring to. Now, what's my point? Maybe it's obvious, but if not, let me make it crystal clear. The internet, and especially social media, link billions and billions of people who would otherwise never have a chance of crossing paths. The roads back then, It's a parallel situation. They enabled travel, but they also enabled the spread of ideas, linking people who would never be able to connect in any other way if these roads hadn't existed. And it allowed the idea of the gospel and Jesus to spread and start all these brand new Jesus-centered communities. And I want to say that that opportunity is here for us today at a way larger scale than back then. Two things are abundantly true. Jesus' command to make disciples and spread the gospel to the ends of the earth still applies to Christians today. And we have access to an even more powerful road system than was available to Paul, the greatest Christianity spreader of all time. When you think about the power of the internet, and especially social media, it has never been easier to tell people about Jesus. And what is even crazier is that most of these tools don't have a cost associated with them, other than us having to give all our data to these companies. But really, the cost to spread the gospel on social media is virtually zero. Dave Dummett, he's the new pastor of Willow Creek Community Church right outside of Chicago. He recently said, you used to have to pay millions of dollars to reach thousands of people, but now you can pay thousands of dollars to reach millions of people. And I think if I'm remembering right, he was referring to churches. And, maybe they could theoretically spend thousands of dollars buying equipment, filming the videos, maybe purchasing ad space. But for the average Christian, it's basically free. Now, let me be real with you. My guess is that for any Christians watching this, you probably were not sharing your faith very often before the pandemic started. And this guess is not because I have a low view of you. It's because I've read the statistics. Christians today are doing an absolutely horrendous job of evangelizing. I've talked about this in the past, and we'll link that video. So realistically, you are probably in the vast majority of Christians who does not regularly share their faith with anyone. Maybe some of you are, sharing it often, but you are by far the outlier. And then probably to you, if you're someone who wasn't sharing your faith very often, the pandemic probably made it seem even harder to tell people about Jesus. If you were trying to stick to the COVID, lockdown guidelines and you were limiting your contact to the same group of people, you might not have even had anyone that you could share the gospel with in that little group. But here's the bittersweet reality. The capacity to talk about Jesus on social media has always been there, pandemic or no pandemic. There are churches and Christians who have been doing this literally for decades, even if they've been in the minority. Now, other people in churches are finally realizing the potential that exists with social media. And it's only because the pandemic literally forced them to open their eyes to this reality. Churches had 100 different biblical reasons why they would never post their church services on Facebook. And then the virus forced their buildings to shut their doors. And suddenly people had all sorts of new biblical revelations that allowed them to start sharing online. The church in general, unfortunately, in the last few hundred years, has been very slow to adopt new technology. Sometimes this can be a good thing. It can take some time to, flesh out how theology intersects with these new inventions. Sometimes there needs to be a time of reflection and prayer to try and determine whether or not Christians should use some new technology or not. But I think that there's a deeper reason that churches and Christians in general are hesitant to use social media. And I think it's more tied to that commandment of Jesus to go to the ends of the earth. I'm not the first person to point this out, but the natural gravitational pull of all Christian communities is always to focus inward. When faced with the decision to either spread the gospel to new people or just focus on caring for the people already in our communities, the easier option is always focusing inward. And so it's easy to write off something like social media that's very outward-facing by design and think, listen, I'm just going to care about the people that I can see right in front of me. But Jesus, he didn't want us to just care about the Christians in our communities. He wanted us to reach new people with the incredible news of the gospel. Now, as much as I'd like to say that I was one of the early adopters of using social media for ministry, I am just as guilty of downplaying it as anyone else. I might not have had any, theological convictions against using social media. I just thought it was completely irrelevant to the job of a pastor. I was leading this church service in the city of Chicago for about 150 people, and I thought, why would I waste my time trying to reach new people online? I've got all these people right here. But then the pandemic shut down all the services, and I had a time to re-examine my thoughts about online ministry altogether. And I had a Paul-like change of heart because here I am leading an online ministry. And I would also love to say that I knew the potential when Church started, but I was skeptical about it even as recent as 2 months ago. I was having a conversation with my brother who's a pastor down in the South, and we were talking about Church. And I was saying, as much as I started this cool, fully online church community, it's still really only growing the same way an in-person church would grow. We haven't cracked the social media code. We're basically just going door to door and inviting people directly, even if those doors are digital. And most of our growth still relies entirely, on my mom inviting hundreds or thousands of people that she knows personally. And so I had this conversation with him, and this is how I was thinking through it. And I was like, I know there's potential, but it was only in the last few months that it actually started to click. We recently posted an Instagram reel, which if you don't know, these go to all sorts of random people just based on how the Instagram algorithm works. And randomly, a kid named Chris started following us. And he liked what we posted, and then he eventually saw that we meet on Zoom. And then he came on a few weeks ago, and he really liked it and decided to stick around for the breakout room, smaller group discussion that meets right after the main session. And now he's a part of this community, and he's met other people. He's learning and growing. And so me and the other Church leadership, we were stoked that this happened, but it was still only one person. And then a few weeks later, we had actually 25 new people show up. They had all heard about us from Instagram, mainly through the guests that we had brought on who were sharing about Church on their pages. And these people who were coming were from all over the country, some of them even outside of the United States. And I can tell you, in all my time being a pastor in downtown Chicago, we never had more than maybe 10 people who were new on a single Sunday. And that was very, very rare. Normally, we had one or two or maybe even no new people on a week. So this just absolutely blew our minds. I'm not saying we've cracked some sort of social media code, but this tiny little bit of success was so encouraging. But even more encouraging are the stories that I hear from people like you watching this video, not pastors, but regular Christians who are posting, resharing Church content or other Christian content or some of their own content about Jesus, and how it's starting spiritual conversations with all sorts of people who would never come to a physical church. I'll hear about people posting and having former friends from high school reach out. And this is like a regular occurrence. Some of them have come on the Zoom and some haven't. But any spiritual conversations that come as a result from social media are a win in my book. I believe that the church in America finally has the chance to break out of this cycle of being so inwardly focused. I believe that we can take advantage of our Roman road system and start to fulfill the commandment that Jesus gave us to preach the gospel and to make disciples from your hometown all the way to the ends of the earth. Now, I want to give 3 quick ways that we can do this, that we can use social media to spread the message of Jesus. These mostly apply to Instagram, but you can probably figure out the equivalent way of applying them to Facebook or MySpace or whatever else you're using. Number 1, reshare Church content or any other church content on your stories. This is super low-hanging fruit, but it has a lot of potential. If you share the stuff that we post and add a little bit of your own commentary, do not be surprised if you get people coming out of the woodwork to ask you questions about it. We try to come up with topics and ideas that would be relevant or applicable even to people outside of the church. But the point is not just to get people talking about Church. You probably follow other Christian accounts as well. Share some of their stuff and give a little bit of your own thoughts about it. I guarantee that you'll start having spiritual conversations left and right. Number 2, share your own Christianity-related content. If you're reading a good Christian book, take a screenshot or a picture of it and share it on your story. If you're someone who makes videos, make a video about something that God is teaching you. Social media is a lot like the public square. You have all sorts of people hanging out there who will hear what you say and be curious about it. If you start having a conversation with someone and they ask you something that you can't answer, feel free to send us a message. I'd be happy to give you any advice that you might need. And third, invite people to come to Church. Like I said, we try to make Church, the Zoom meeting every Tuesday night, the least threatening place imaginable. You used to have to invite people to a physical building, which meant that they had to leave their houses, drive somewhere, figure out where to park, figure out where to walk, come in, try to find the sanctuary, find a place to sit, not know what to wear, not know what to expect. And now you just have to ask someone to come on a Zoom call. And if they hate it, they can literally just leave the call immediately. It is the lowest pressure situation possible. Now, maybe you have some questions about this. We have another video with our guest speaker, and hopefully that can answer some of the questions you might have. Otherwise, feel free to put them in the comments, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. And maybe you're feeling skeptical because you know the downsides of social media. Remember, like I said, this is a 2-part video. We will be talking through that, all of it next week when we post the second half of this video.